With the outbreak of World War II, car production around many parts of the world ended in the late 1930s, but most American brands continued into 1942, at least those that survived that long. Crosley was a newcomer to the budget end of the market, with roughly 4,000 made prior to the war. Priced from $300 to $500, it was only offered on an 80-inch wheelbase and weighed less than 1,000 pounds. Powered by a 580cc twin, or 39 cubic inches, producing nearly 14 horsepower. It undercut the struggling American Bantam that cost $400 to $600, was on a smaller 75-inch wheelbase, and weighed 1,300 to 1,400 pounds. But it used a bigger 820cc, or 50 cubic inch, inline four with 22 horsepower. Less than 1,000 were built for 1940 and 41. As their last gasp, they created what would become the military Jeep, a vehicle that would soon become the savior of Willis. But Willis produced the Americar passenger cars into 1942, priced in the range of $600 to $800 on a 104-inch wheelbase and weighing 2,100 to 2,500 pounds. Their size and weight made them popular for hot rodders. But the factory engine was a 2.2-liter, 134 cubic inch Go Devil inline four with 63 horsepower, and 1941 sales amounted to 22,000. On the more mainstream side of the market was the Plymouth of 1940. Most used a 117-inch wheelbase, although a 137-inch wheelbase 7-passenger version was available. Weight ranged from 2,800 to 3,400 pounds, and prices $600 to $1,100. The only engine was a 3.3-liter, 201 cubic inch flathead 6, making 84 horsepower. It was a top seller, producing nearly 425,000 for the year. It didn't do as well as Ford did, however, who sold 540,000 the same year, with prices starting between $700 and $900. Although somewhat smaller, on a 112-inch wheelbase, and 2,500 to 2,800 pounds. It offered a 2.2-liter 136 or 3.6-liter 221 flathead V8 with 60 or 85 horsepower. Sales increased in 1941, and Chevrolet led the way, climbing to just over $1 million for the year. It was $700 to $1,000 on a 116-inch wheelbase and weighed 3,000 to 3,400 pounds, and its 3.5-liter 217 cubic inch stove-bolt straight 6 produced 90 horsepower. Studebakers could be a bit more upmarket, offered on 110, 119, and 125-inch wheelbases, and priced from $700 to $1,300. Weight was in the range of 2,400 to 3,500 pounds, and engine options included an 80 horsepower 2.8-liter 170 or 94 horsepower 3.7-liter 226 straight 6, or a 4.1-liter 250 straight 8 with 117 horsepower. 1941 sales were nearly 135,000. The 1940 Hudsons came on 113, 118, and 125-inch wheelbases and weighed 2,800 to 3,400 pounds, and were also priced from $700 to $1,300. Offered with a 92 horsepower 2.9-liter 175 or 98 to 102 horsepower 3.5-liter 212 straight 6, or an 128 horsepower 4.2-liter 254 straight 8. Sales were just under 90,000. Dodges of the same year mostly used a 120-inch wheelbase, although it also offered a 7-passenger version that was on a 140-inch wheelbase. Weight was 2,900 to 3,500 pounds, and prices were $800 to $1,200. Powered by a 3.6-liter 218 straight 6 with 87 horsepower. Sales were just under 200,000. The 1941 Pontiac came on a 119 or 122-inch wheelbase and weighed 3,100 to 3,700 pounds. Prices were $800 to $1,300, and engines were a 3.9-liter 239 straight 6 with 90 horsepower, or a 4.1-liter 249 straight 8 with 103 horsepower. Sales for the year were $330,000. In 1941, Nash introduced the small 112-inch wheelbase unibody 600 to go along with the more traditional 121-inch wheelbase Ambassador, giving Nash a price range of $800 to $1,300 and a weight range of 2,500 to 3,600 pounds, and total sales near 85,000. The 600 used a 2.8-liter 173 straight 6 with 75 horsepower, and the Ambassador a 3.9-liter 235 straight 6 with 105 horsepower, or a 4.3-liter 261 straight 8 with 115 horsepower. The 1940 Oldsmobile was the first to offer a fully automatic transmission and was priced from $800 to $1,600. Wheelbases were 116, 120, and 124 inches, and weighed 3,000 to 3,800 pounds. Powered by either a 95 horsepower 3.8 liter 230 straight 6 or an 110 horsepower 4.2 liter 257 straight 8. Sales for the year amounted to $185,000. Mercury had recently been created as an upmarket Ford, and in 1941 it used a 118-inch wheelbase and weighed 3,000 to 3,400 pounds. Prices were between $900 and $1,100, and the 3.9 liter 239 V8 produced 95 horsepower, making for sales over $80,000. Buicks for that year were priced from $900 to $2,500, but still managed to sell nearly $375,000. Offered in 118, 121, 126, 128, and 139-inch wheelbases. Weight ranged from 3,600 to 4,800 pounds. The overhead valve Fireball Straight 8 came in 4.1 liter 248 with 115 to 125 horsepower, or 5.2 liter 320 with 165 horsepower. Packard had one of the widest range of models in 1940, with prices ranging from as low as $900 to as high as $6,300. They were offered in wheelbases of 122, 127, 138, and 148 inches, with weight ranging from 3,100 to 4,500 pounds. The engine range included a 4-liter 245 straight 6 with 100 horsepower, an 120 horsepower 4.6-liter 282 straight 8, or a 5.8-liter 356 straight 8 with 160 horsepower. Sales for the year were nearly $100,000. In 1942, DeSoto was essentially the entry-level Chrysler, but they introduced the automatic pop-up headlight, offered in a 122-inch wheelbase or a 140-inch wheelbase Suburban. Weight was 3,200 to 3,800 pounds, and prices $1,000 to $1,600. The only engine was a 3.9-liter 237 straight 6 with 115 horsepower, and even with reduced production, sales were still over $95,000 for the year. The Chrysler of 1941 used a 122, 128, 140, or 146-inch wheelbase on the Imperial. Price from $1,000 to $2,800. Weight was 3,300 to 4,600 pounds. Base engine was a 4-liter 242 straight 6 with 108 to 115 horsepower. The option, a 5.3-liter 324 straight 8 with 137 to 143 horsepower, putting sales over $160,000. Hupmobile Skylark sales squeaked into 1941, climbing to just over 300 for the decade. Using old cord body tooling, it was on a 115-inch wheelbase and weighed 3,000 pounds. Prices started at $1,100, and the 4-liter 245 straight 6 produced 101 horsepower. Its body was shared with the final Graham Hollywood, but the shark-nosed Graham carried into 1940. They were priced from $1,100 to $1,300 on a 120-inch wheelbase and weighed 3,200 to 3,400 pounds. The Graham engine was a 3.6-liter 218 straight 6 with 93 horsepower, or 120 horsepower in supercharged form. It's estimated that about 1,000 were built before it was discontinued. LaSalle saw its last year as the entry-level Cadillac in 1940. On an 123-inch wheelbase and weighing 3,700 to 4,100 pounds, it was priced from $1,200 to $1,800, and the 5.3-liter 322 V8 produced 130 horsepower, and sales were near $25,000. Lincolns of 1941 ranged from the sleek Zephyr to the stylish Continental, priced from $1,500 to $2,900, on an 125-inch wheelbase, or as the 138-inch wheelbase Custom. Weight was 3,600 to 4,300 pounds, and the 4.8-liter 292 V12 provided 120 horsepower. Sales were under $20,000. While most 1941 Cadillacs were on an 126-inch wheelbase, 136 and 139-inch wheelbase versions were also offered. Prices ranged from $1,500 to $4,000, weight from 4,000 to 4,900 pounds, and the 5.7-liter 346 V8 produced 150 horsepower. Sales for the year were over $65,000. In Britain, the Austin 8 would continue into the war, with more than $55,000 being made over the decade. It used an 88-inch wheelbase and a 900cc side valve 4, initially providing 28 horsepower. Ford introduced the Anglia in 1939, with 55,000 of the first generation eventually being built. It was on a 90-inch wheelbase, and prices started around £100, typically powered by a 900cc or 57 cubic inch side valve 4. But export models could have a bigger 1200 72 cubic inch version with up to 30 horsepower. The standard Flying 8 was made until 1941 and was priced from 125 to 160 pounds. On an 83-inch wheelbase, it was powered by a 1000cc inline 4, rated at 28 to 31 horsepower. Riley 12 sales carried into 1940, even if production didn't. It used an 108-inch wheelbase and a 1500cc inline 4 with 51 horsepower, and by this point had began sharing components with MG and Wolseley. Introduced in 1939, the Sunbeam Talbot 2-liter used a side valve 4-cylinder engine from the Hillman 14 for 52 horsepower. It was on a 97-inch wheelbase, and 1,300 would be made. MG made 379 of the TB Midget in 1940, priced around $1,100. It used an 82-inch wheelbase and was powered by a 1.3-liter, or 76 cubic inch, overhead cam 4 with 54 horsepower. Vauxhall made the Big 6 into 1940, offered on either a 111 or 130-inch wheelbase. The 3.2-liter straight 6 was rated at 27 taxable horsepower, having somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 65 actual horsepower. Nearly 7,000 of the later series cars were made over their 5-year run. The Daimler DB18, which would later be called the Consort, was on a 114-inch wheelbase. Its 2.5-liter overhead valve inline 6 produced nearly 70 horsepower, and less than 1,000 were made. Bentley produced 11 complete Mark V's between 1939 and 1941, and an additional 6 chassis, most having an 124-inch wheelbase. Called the 4 1/4, the 4.3-liter straight 6 produced around 120 horsepower. In France, the Renault Juve was available in body styles ranging from coupe to panel van. On a 93-inch wheelbase and weighing around 1,700 pounds, it was powered by a 1-liter inline 4 with 23 horsepower. The Peugeot 202 continued production into 1942, and it used a 96-inch wheelbase and weighed 2,000 pounds, using an 1,100cc inline 4 with 30 horsepower. Citroën made somewhere between 1,500 and 6,500 of the front-wheel drive Traction Avant after entering the war. Wheelbases came in 115, 122, and 129-inch lengths, and weight was 2,300 to 2,600 pounds. Engine choices included a 1.6-liter or 1.9-liter inline 4, or a 2.9-liter 6 with 55 to 77 horsepower. Production of the Delahaye 135 was always limited and often custom-bodied. Wheelbase was 116 inches, and weight ranged from 2,800 to 3,600 pounds, using a 3.2-liter straight 6 with 95 to 110 horsepower. Germany offered the front-wheel drive DKW F8 starting in 1939 on a 100-inch wheelbase. It weighed 1,500 to 2,000 pounds, with either a 600 or 700cc two-stroke twin, producing 18 or 20 horsepower. The popular Mercedes-Benz 170V was produced until the factory was bombed in 1942, then returned again after the war. It used an 112-inch wheelbase and was powered by a 1.7-liter inline 4 with 37 horsepower. Pre-war production of the BMW 327 was around 2,500, and it cost the equivalent of $3,000 in Germany at the time. On a 108-inch wheelbase and weighing 2,400 pounds, its 2-liter inline 6 made around 55 horsepower. In Italy in 1939, the Fiat 508C became the 1100, and 1941 added a van version. The 95-inch wheelbase carried over, and the inline 4 produced 36 horsepower. Lancia's Aprilia would see continued use during the war. It was on a 108-inch wheelbase, weighing approximately 2,000 pounds, and its 1500 B4 provided 48 horsepower. The pre-war exotic Italian sports car was the Alfa Romeo 6C 2500, offered as an 128-inch wheelbase Turismo, 118-inch wheelbase Sport, or 106-inch wheelbase Super Sport. Its inline 6 produced 90 to 110 horsepower. In Sweden, there were less than 200 of the Volvo PV800 built before the war. It had an 128-inch wheelbase and was powered by a 3.7-liter straight six with approximately 85 horsepower. From Czechoslovakia, the Skoda Popular was on an 87-inch wheelbase and weighed 2,000 pounds. Priced under 300 pounds, power came from either a 1,000 or 1,100 cc 4 with 22 to 32 horsepower, while the rear-engine Tatra 87, or T87, cost 25,000 Swiss francs in 1941. One of the early Streamliners, it had an 112-inch wheelbase, weighed 3,000 pounds, and was pushed along by an 85 horsepower 3-liter V8. The Soviet Gaz M1 was based on the 34 Ford, and in 1940 started using a Dodge 218 straight six providing 75 horsepower, using an 112-inch wheelbase. Weight was 3,000 to 3,200 pounds, while the ZIS 101A was based on the 1933 Buick on an 142-inch wheelbase. It was powered by a 5.8-liter 351 cubic inch overhead valve straight 8 with around 110 horsepower. In Japan, the Toyota AA and AB had styling inspired by the Chrysler Airflow on an 112-inch wheelbase and weighing 3,300 pounds, using a copy of the 3.4-liter Chevrolet Stovebolt 207 straight six, producing 62 horsepower. Most of these brands would return after the war, along with many others, and several upstarts. So as always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.